It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day that feels ordinary, almost unremarkable. The kind of day when people sip coffee on their balconies, when traffic hums along like clockwork, and when families gather around lunch tables without a single thought that the world might suddenly tilt on its axis. But for the Reiner family, December 14th would become a day seared into memory, a day that would fracture the public perception of a family and ignite questions no one was ready to answer. At approximately 3:30 p.m., a call came into the Los Angeles Fire Department. It was a call like so many others, simple on the surface, routine in form, reporting that medical assistance was needed at a private residence. But nothing about this afternoon would remain ordinary. When first responders arrived, they found something unimaginable. Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner, 68, were dead. And whispers immediately began to circulate. The most horrifying rumor? That their son, Nick, the very person who had grown up under their guidance, who had shared their joys and sorrows, was being accused of taking their lives. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine hearing such news. Imagine the disbelief, the gut-wrenching impossibility of it all. How could someone who once held your hand, laughed with you in the kitchen, or argued with you over trivial matters, become the subject of such a devastating accusation? In the hours that followed, social media erupted with speculation. Headlines flashed, some tentative, others sensational. Rob Reiner and wife found dead, son under suspicion. The story spread like wildfire, fueled by a combination of curiosity, fear, and morbid fascination. And yet, amid the frenzy, the truth remained elusive. Authorities were cautious, reluctant to confirm the rumors that had already taken on a life of their own. But what makes a story like this so compelling is not just the tragedy of two lives lost. It is the human drama. The cracks that appear in a family when suspicion and fear take root, the whispers that can spiral into accusations, the devastating weight of being labeled a perpetrator in the court of public opinion before evidence has been fully examined. Nick Reiner, a son, was thrust into the spotlight overnight. His private grief became public spectacle. And now, after days of silence, he finally speaks. Before we delve into his first-hand account, we must understand the context. The lives Rob and Michelle built, the family dynamics that shaped their home, and the public image they carried. Rob Reiner, not to be confused with the filmmaker of the same name, was known in his circles for his quiet strength and commitment to his family. Michelle Singer Reiner was equally admired, a woman who balanced professional ambitions with the nurturing of her home, who friends described as compassionate and thoughtful. Together, they were the picture of stability, a partnership forged over decades, grounded in mutual respect and shared memories. Their lives were punctuated by celebrations, milestones, ordinary moments that defined the human experience. Birthdays, anniversaries, quiet dinners, laughter echoing through their home. And yet, as with many families, the public image often conceals the private reality. For years, Nick lived in the shadow of this image. Friends recall him as a devoted son, often attentive to his parents' needs, involved in their routines, engaged in their lives in ways that seemed ordinary yet meaningful. But there were also signs of tension, small disagreements, moments of frustration that are common in any household. Perhaps they were trivial, perhaps they hinted at deeper fissures that no one fully understood. What matters now is that those fissures, whatever their size, would be interpreted under the harshest of lights, magnified by tragedy and speculation. The day of the incident, authorities were careful to protect the integrity of the investigation. The Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles Fire Department, and other emergency responders acted with precision, documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and ensuring that every step adhered to procedural standards. Yet, despite their professionalism, the public narrative began to take shape almost immediately. Family members, neighbors, and acquaintances began to whisper about what might have happened, some even speculating that Nick himself was involved. Social media amplified these whispers into roars, and soon, names and theories were circulating in ways that no one could control. In moments like these, the human tendency to seek answers can be both comforting and dangerous. Comforting because we crave closure, explanations, and reasons for the unthinkable. Dangerous because speculation often fills the gaps where facts have not yet arrived. And the Reiner family's tragedy is a stark reminder of this delicate balance. Every rumor, every online post, every conversation between neighbors contributed to a narrative that may or may not reflect reality. It is in this charged environment that Nick made his first public statement. After days of silence, he finally broke through the wall of whispers and accusations. The statement was brief but powerful. "I am not the killer." The words themselves were simple, yet they carried immense weight. Consider for a moment what it means to declare your innocence when the world has already begun to assume your guilt. To speak these words publicly is to embrace scrutiny, criticism, and doubt, all while processing the grief of losing one's parents. And yet, Nick's declaration is only the beginning. It opens a window into the complexities of grief, familial loyalty, and the human need to assert one's truth in the face of overwhelming skepticism. The significance of this story extends beyond the Reiner family alone. It touches on universal themes: the fragility of trust, the volatility of public opinion, the ways in which tragedy can warp perception, and the ethical dilemmas that arise when accusations precede evidence. As we explore Nick's account, the family history, and the unfolding investigation, you may find yourself asking uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know those closest to us? How easily can rumor and suspicion fracture a community? And, in the face of devastating loss, what does it mean to seek truth, justice, or even closure? This is not a story with easy answers. It is a story with layers of emotion, tension, and contradiction. It is a story that demands attention, empathy, and critical thought. And most importantly, it is a story that is still evolving, with new revelations emerging as the investigation continues. As we journey through this narrative, we will explore every angle: the timeline of events, the relationships that define the Reiner family, the conflicting reports that have surfaced, and the perspectives of those closest to the tragedy. Each chapter will peel back another layer, revealing not just what happened, but why it matters, and what it says about the human condition. So, let us begin at the point where the world's perception collided with personal grief. The moment when the ordinary Sunday afternoon turned into a day of unimaginable loss, suspicion, and revelation. The moment when Nick Reiner's life changed forever, thrust into a spotlight he neither sought nor deserved. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It started like any other Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. Birds chirped lazily in the distance, the distant hum of traffic carried on the wind. Families strolled in quiet neighborhoods, unaware that by the end of the day, one of these homes would become the center of a story that would grip the city, the country, and eventually, the world. The Reiner home, a modest yet elegant residence tucked into a serene part of the city, seemed untouched by time. From the outside, everything appeared ordinary. But on December 14th, 2025, ordinary would shatter. At precisely 3:30 p.m., an emergency call went out to the Los Angeles Fire Department. Someone had requested medical assistance. The dispatcher's voice was calm, the words procedural, but beneath the surface, the unknown hung heavy. What exactly awaited the responders? Minutes later, a team of firefighters and paramedics arrived at the scene, expecting perhaps a routine medical emergency. What they found instead was a tableau of tragedy. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Singer Reiner, 68, were dead. The home, normally filled with warmth and the quiet hum of family life, had become a scene of silence, of sudden, incomprehensible absence. Neighbors who witnessed the arrival of first responders described a scene unlike anything they had ever imagined. One woman, who had lived across the street for over 20 years, recalled the flashing lights, the hushed conversations of officers, and the unmistakable air of shock that permeated the neighborhood. "It was surreal," she said. "One minute I was sipping my coffee, and the next, it felt like something terrible had descended on our street. I couldn't believe it. Rob and Michelle? They were such a lovely couple." Almost immediately, rumors began to swirl. In the era of social media, a story does not remain contained. Neighbors speculated, friends messaged friends, and soon, the world was whispering the unthinkable. the Reiner's son, Nick, might have been involved. The whispers carried a weight that was almost unbearable. Could it be true? Could someone so intimately connected to the victims, someone who had been raised under their guidance and care, be responsible for such a horrific act? It was a question that no one wanted to ask, but everyone feared to ignore. The police arrived shortly after the first responders, adding a layer of official gravity to the scene. They began their methodical work, photographs, documentation, interviews, but they spoke little to the press. Their silence, however necessary, left room for speculation to grow unchecked. Meanwhile, the media descended, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, capturing every reaction, every tear, every whispered rumor. Headlines began to form almost instantaneously. Son accused in tragic deaths of parents. Family tragedy in Los Angeles. Nick Reiner under investigation. The words were stark, almost accusatory, and in that instant, Nick Reiner became more than a grieving son. He became a figure under scrutiny, a symbol of suspicion. But what did the world not yet know? What was hidden behind the flashing lights and urgent news alerts? The truth, as it often is, was more complex than the headlines could capture. Rob and Michelle had lived lives that were full, multifaceted, and deeply human. Their days had been filled with ordinary joys, morning coffee routines, conversations over the dinner table, laughter echoing in hallways. And yet, as with any family, there had been tension, disagreement, moments of unspoken conflict. These complexities, mundane to those living them, became magnified under the harsh lens of tragedy. In the immediate hours following the discovery, investigators were meticulous. They secured the scene, collected evidence, and spoke to family members and acquaintances. Every detail mattered. What had Rob and Michelle been doing that afternoon? Where was Nick? Who else had visited the home in the days leading up to the incident? These questions formed the backbone of an investigation that would soon capture national attention. And yet, even as law enforcement worked, the narrative outside their walls was spiraling, driven by curiosity, fear, and the human need for answers. For Nick, the day was an unimaginable crucible. Not only had he lost both of his parents, but he was now confronted with whispers of suspicion, whispers that hinted at something far darker than mere tragedy. Imagine the weight of standing in the shadow of loss while the world begins to question your very humanity. Imagine sitting in your home, grief-stricken, and reading posts that suggest you are capable of what you cannot fathom yourself. It is a reality that few can comprehend, yet it was the reality that Nick faced. Friends and acquaintances began to speak, their voices carrying both empathy and unease. "I can't believe this is happening," one family friend said. Nick loved his parents. He wouldn't hurt them. But you hear these things, and it shakes you. The ambiguity, the lack of clear answers, intensified the drama. In the absence of confirmed facts, the mind tends to fill in the gaps, often with the most extreme possibilities. And in Nick's case, the extremes were both terrifying and tragic. As the afternoon turned to evening, the city seemed to hold its breath. News outlets continued to report, social media buzzed with speculation, and within the Reiner family, private grief collided with public scrutiny. The emotional toll was immense. Family members who had come to support Nick were themselves navigating a maze of shock, fear, and disbelief. Every conversation, every visit, was heavy with unspoken questions. Could this really be true? How could it happen? What did we miss? By nightfall, the story had taken on a life of its own. Online discussions speculated about motive, about opportunity, about the very nature of familial relationships. Experts weighed in, some cautiously, others more boldly, discussing patterns of familial violence, the psychology of grief, and the phenomenon of public perception overtaking factual investigation. But through it all, one voice remained absent, the voice of Nick himself. His silence was not an admission, not a confession, but a necessary pause, a moment to collect himself, to process the incomprehensible, and to prepare to speak his truth. And when he finally did, the words would shock, move, and challenge the assumptions that had already taken root in the minds of the public. "I am not the killer." Simple, declarative, yet loaded with the weight of grief, fear, and determination. To assert innocence in such circumstances is an act of courage, of defiance, and of hope. A hope that the world will pause, listen, and consider that not everything is as it seems. But what does this story tell us beyond the immediate tragedy? It is a reminder of the fragility of trust, the volatility of rumor, and the power of public perception. It is a cautionary tale about how quickly suspicion can take root, how easily a narrative can spiral, and how vital it is to seek truth amid chaos. And it is a deeply human story about loss, accusation, and the struggle to assert one's truth when everything feels stacked against you. As we move forward, we will explore not just the events of December 14th, but the lives that led to that day, the relationships that defined the Reiner family, and the perspectives of those closest to the tragedy. Each detail, each moment, will be examined, not to sensationalize, but to understand. To understand how a seemingly ordinary Sunday could turn into a crucible of grief, suspicion, and revelation. And through it all, we will follow Nick's journey, his struggle to assert his innocence, and the unfolding investigation that continues to captivate and confound. The day the news broke was more than a headline. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge perceptions, ignite debate, and force us to confront uncomfortable questions about family, grief, and the fragility of human trust. And as the world watched, Nick Reiner prepared to break his silence, a silence that would reveal more than just words. It would reveal the heart of a son navigating unimaginable circumstances. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Before tragedy struck, before whispers and accusations began to circulate, before the world's gaze turned sharply onto a single family, Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner lived lives that, on the surface, appeared ordinary, yet were layered with complexity, ambition, and quiet devotion. To understand the gravity of what happened, we must first understand the people at the center of this storm, the lives they led, the values they cherished, and the intricate dynamics that defined their home. Because a family is never just a collection of names and dates. It is a living, breathing entity, full of love, tension, secrets, and unspoken truths. Rob Reiner, 78, was a man whose presence exuded calm authority. He was the kind of person who commanded respect not through force or intimidation, but through consistency and integrity. Friends described him as reliable, steady, and deeply committed to those he loved. In his professional life, he maintained a reputation for diligence and precision, someone colleagues could depend on for sound judgment and level-headed advice. But it was in his personal life where Rob's character truly shone. He was a devoted husband and father, someone who took pleasure in the small details of family life. A shared joke at the dinner table, the quiet satisfaction of a home well kept, the pride of watching his children grow and succeed. Michelle Singer Reiner, 68, complimented Rob's grounded nature with warmth, energy, and a nurturing spirit. She was known for her sharp intellect, her compassion, and her ability to balance multiple roles effortlessly. Friends often spoke of her capacity to make anyone feel seen and heard, a rare quality in a world often preoccupied with appearances over substance. Michelle was a woman of habit and ritual, someone who found meaning in the rhythms of daily life, whether it was preparing a favorite meal for family gatherings or volunteering in the community. Together, Rob and Michelle presented the image of a harmonious, accomplished couple, united in both purpose and affection. But even in families that appear picture-perfect, complexities exist. The Reiners were no exception. Behind closed doors, like any family, they experienced tensions, disagreements, and the subtle strains of long-term partnership. Friends and acquaintances who knew the family well speak of moments when Rob and Michelle's patience was tested, when differing opinions sparked heated debates, and when unspoken expectations created invisible walls. These dynamics, often invisible to outsiders, contribute to the tapestry of family life. Threads that can fray under stress, yet can also strengthen resilience. Nick, their son, grew up in this environment. He witnessed both the love and the tension, the laughter and the arguments. From an early age, he learned the rhythms of his household, absorbing lessons from both parents about loyalty, responsibility, and the weight of ethical choices. Friends describe him as attentive, sometimes intense, and deeply affected by the well-being of his parents. He shared ordinary moments with them, school events, family holidays, quiet evenings. But he also bore witness to the subtle pressures of family life, from minor disagreements to more significant moments of stress. The public image of Rob and Michelle, however, rarely captured these nuances. To the outside world, they were admired, respected, and largely uncontroversial figures. Headlines, when they appeared, focused on their community involvement, professional achievements, or social engagements. But the lives of individuals, particularly within the private sphere of family, are never fully represented in public narratives. There is always more beneath the surface, hidden in shared glances, whispered conversations, and the private struggles that shape human experience. In exploring who Rob and Michelle were, it is impossible to ignore the environment in which they lived, a world of relative privilege and security, yet not immune to the universal pressures of aging, financial concerns, and family expectations. Friends recount moments when Rob expressed pride in Michelle's accomplishments, when Michelle spoke warmly of Rob's steadfastness, and when both shared anecdotes that revealed humor, vulnerability, and humanity. These glimpses offer insight into a couple who, despite their challenges, built a life grounded in love and mutual respect. But tragedy often exposes the fragility beneath apparent stability. The very dynamics that shaped Rob and Michelle's lives, their devotion, their routines, their expectations, would become focal points for speculation after their deaths. Observers began to question the nature of their relationships, the pressures within their household, and the moments of tension that, in hindsight, might have hinted at deeper complexities. And it is here, at this intersection of perception and reality, that the narrative begins to twist. Because while the couple's public and private lives were largely harmonious, tragedy has a way of magnifying imperfections and inviting assumptions that may not align with reality. As we consider who Rob and Michelle were, it is essential to recognize the role of perception. To the outside world, they were accomplished, stable, and devoted. To those who lived with them, they were multifaceted, capable of joy, humor, patience, and occasionally frustration. And to Nick, they were his parents, figures of authority, sources of guidance, and objects of profound love. Understanding their identities is not merely an exercise in biography. It is a means of contextualizing the shock, grief, and accusations that followed their deaths. Even in the days leading up to December 14th, Rob and Michelle maintained routines that reflected their personalities. They attended social engagements, managed household affairs, and engaged in discussions about family, finance, and community involvement. Friends recall seeing them together at events, laughing with acquaintances, and demonstrating the collaborative partnership that had defined their decades together. Yet, as is true in any life, external appearances can mask internal struggles. Minor disagreements about finances, health concerns, or household responsibilities, though not unusual, could create subtle tensions that remained private until external events cast them into stark relief. In retrospect, every family moment, every interaction, every routine takes on a new significance. Simple gestures, a smile at the breakfast table, a reprimand for an overdue task, a discussion about plans for the weekend, can become evidence of closeness or, under darker scrutiny, suspicion. It is this duality that makes family stories so compelling. The same behaviors that define intimacy can, in the wrong context, be misinterpreted or sensationalized. And in the aftermath of tragedy, misinterpretation is almost inevitable. As we reflect on Rob and Michelle's lives, it becomes clear that they were more than the subjects of headlines. They were individuals who built a life together, raised a son, and navigated the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of family life. Their story is a reminder of the complexities of human relationships, the fragility of perception, and the enduring impact of love and loss. Understanding them is critical to understanding the events that followed, because the dynamics of their household, the nature of their relationships, and the patterns of daily life provide the context for the extraordinary and tragic developments that would soon unfold. But as we prepare to explore the next chapter, the life of their son, Nick, it is essential to carry forward one understanding. Families are not static. They are living, breathing entities shaped by history, personality, and circumstance. And when tragedy strikes, every nuance, every interaction, every tension can be magnified, reframed, and scrutinized. The Reiners were no exception. The very qualities that defined their love, their devotion, and their humanity would now intersect with suspicion, rumor, and grief in ways that no one could have predicted. And what comes next is where the world begins to focus on Nick Reiner himself. The son, the accused, the grieving child, whose story will challenge assumptions, provoke debate, and demand that we reconsider everything we think we know about family, tragedy, and truth. But what Nick reveals in his first words will shock even those who believe they understood him best. Every family has a central figure, the one whose presence ties together the dynamics, the laughter, the arguments, the unspoken rules. For the Reiner family, that person was often seen as Nick, their only son. But what happens when that central figure becomes the focus of suspicion, of rumor, and of public scrutiny? What happens when a son, known to those closest as a devoted child, is suddenly cast in a narrative he did not choose, one that paints him as something unthinkable? To understand the unfolding tragedy, we must first understand Nick himself, his upbringing, his personality, his relationships with his parents, and the pressures that shaped him into the man he is today. Nick Reiner grew up in a home where love and expectation intertwined. His parents, Rob and Michelle, were guiding forces, sometimes gentle, sometimes insistent, but always invested in his well-being. Friends and acquaintances remember Nick as bright, attentive, and deeply conscientious, someone who internalized both praise and criticism with equal intensity. He was the kind of son who noticed the small things, a parent's favorite cup, the nuance in a tone of voice, the subtle signs of stress. He absorbed the rhythms of family life with careful attention, learning not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. As a child and adolescent, Nick displayed a blend of independence and attachment. He could be fiercely protective of those he loved, yet he sometimes struggled under the weight of expectations. Those who knew him describe him as introspective, occasionally brooding, and highly sensitive to the emotional climate of his household. This sensitivity, while endearing in many ways, also made him deeply attuned to tension, disagreement, and unspoken conflicts, traits that would later shape public perception in the wake of tragedy. Nick's relationship with his father, Rob, was complex yet grounded in mutual respect. Rob was a steadying force in the household, someone whose guidance was both a comfort and a challenge. Nick admired his father's discipline, his sense of responsibility, and his commitment to integrity. Yet, as with any father-son relationship, there were moments of friction, disagreements about choices, misunderstandings about intentions, and the occasional clash of generational perspectives. These conflicts were ordinary, almost inevitable, in the context of a family navigating decades of shared life. With his mother, Michelle, Nick shared a different kind of bond. Michelle's warmth, intellect, and emotional acuity drew him in, creating a relationship built on both affection and subtle negotiation. She was a mother who could guide with empathy, yet also hold firm when necessary. Nick's connection to Michelle was deep, characterized by an understanding that extended beyond words. He could sense her moods, anticipate her concerns, and respond with care, traits that friends and family admired and occasionally envied. But life in the Reiner household was not without pressure. Like many families, there were moments of stress, moments when expectations collided with reality, and moments when communication faltered. Nick, as the only son, sometimes felt the weight of responsibility acutely. He observed his parents' needs, their routines, and their priorities, internalizing an awareness that would later become a double-edged sword. The same attentiveness that made him a caring son also heightened his sensitivity to judgment and, eventually, to suspicion. Nick's public persona, however, remained largely private before the events of December 14th. To outsiders, he was simply the son of a well-regarded couple, largely unseen and unremarkable in the context of their broader social presence. But within the family and among close friends, he was a central figure. Someone whose actions, moods, and decisions carried meaning far beyond their immediate circumstances. It is this duality, private significance versus public anonymity, that makes his story so compelling. When tragedy struck, the world's focus turned to Nick almost instantly. He became the subject of speculation, accusation, and rumor, and the contrast between the son his parents knew and the figure portrayed in the media was stark. Overnight, Nick's grief was compounded by suspicion. Every gesture, every statement, every silence was scrutinized. Friends recount messages of concern and disbelief, noting the almost surreal experience of seeing someone they knew intimately suddenly cast as a potential perpetrator. Yet Nick's response, both in private and eventually in public, demonstrates a resilience shaped by decades of navigating familial complexity. He maintained a sense of dignity even under the most extreme circumstances. He expressed sorrow for the loss of his parents, frustration at the insinuations, and determination to assert his truth. Friends recall conversations where Nick struggled to reconcile his private grief with the relentless public gaze, often noting how difficult it was for him to find moments of solace amidst speculation. Understanding Nick's life prior to December 14th is crucial because it provides context for the statements he would later make, the actions he would take, and the perceptions that would form around him. He was a son shaped by love, expectation, and sensitivity, a son capable of both vulnerability and steadfastness. His personality, history, and family relationships are essential to understanding why his perspective matters, why his voice deserves to be heard, and why the assumption of guilt is not a given. And yet, even as we explore Nick's life, there is an underlying tension. Families, no matter how loving, contain hidden dynamics, unspoken grievances, and moments of misunderstanding. The public rarely sees these subtleties, and in the absence of complete information, assumptions can be dangerous. Nick's story forces us to confront this reality, that the difference between perception and truth can be vast, and that grief, suspicion, and rumor can intersect in ways that distort understanding. As the days following the Reiners' deaths unfolded, Nick was thrust into the spotlight, not by choice, but by circumstance. The narrative of the grieving son collided with the narrative of the accused, creating a tension that was both public and private. Every move he made, every statement he issued, was dissected, analyzed, and sometimes misinterpreted. And yet, despite this pressure, Nick maintained a focus on one thing above all, telling his side of the story, asserting his innocence, and honoring the memory of the parents he had loved deeply. This chapter of Nick's life sets the stage for the complex narrative that follows. It is a story of love, expectation, and family dynamics, of a son whose ordinary life was upended by extraordinary tragedy. It is a story that forces us to question what we think we know about people, about families, and about the assumptions we make in the wake of loss. But even as we understand Nick, we have yet to confront the accusations themselves. The whispers that would turn into headlines, the speculation that would shape public perception, and the statements that would challenge our assumptions about innocence and guilt. The world saw a son, a grieving child, a potential suspect. Nick, meanwhile, was preparing to speak, to reveal the truth as he experienced it. And what he says next, the first words, the first public acknowledgement, will shock many, challenge assumptions, and force a reckoning with the way we perceive tragedy, suspicion, and familial bonds. But what comes after his statement will introduce a complexity no one could have anticipated, a twist that will redefine the narrative entirely. It didn't take long for the quiet shock of tragedy to turn into something far more explosive. Within hours of the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths, whispers began circulating, first among neighbors and family acquaintances, then through social media and news outlets. The impossible question arose almost immediately. Could Nick Reiner, the grieving son who had shared decades of his life with his parents, truly be responsible for their deaths? The notion seemed unthinkable, yet in the age of instant information, the unthinkable spreads faster than the truth ever could. The first rumors were subtle, offhand comments, hushed conversations, fleeting glances that carried suspicion. But suspicion is contagious. What began as a whisper in a quiet neighborhood quickly became speculation online. Friends of the family, while still grappling with their own shock, recounted seeing social media posts suggesting that Nick had something to do with the deaths. Headlines appeared with alarming speed. Son under investigation in parents' deaths. Family tragedy in LA. Could the son be involved? Each headline amplified the uncertainty, adding weight to a narrative that had yet to be confirmed by authorities. Nick's friends were among the first to feel the impact. Messages poured in, expressing disbelief, concern, and support, but there were also messages filled with doubt, fear, and judgment. It was surreal, one longtime friend recounted. One moment, we were mourning with him privately. The next, people online were acting as if he was guilty before a single fact had been confirmed. The speed at which speculation spread was staggering. For Nick, the sudden shift from private grief to public scrutiny must have been disorienting, a dizzying combination of loss and accusation that few could endure without emotional strain. Authorities were careful to maintain the integrity of their investigation. The Los Angeles Police Department, along with the Los Angeles Fire Department, began methodical procedures, interviewing neighbors, documenting the scene, collecting evidence. They refrained from making public statements that could confirm or refute the swirling rumors. But their silence, while professionally necessary, created a vacuum. In the absence of official confirmation, the human mind, and social media, filled the gaps. Every action, every prior argument, every known tension in the household became fodder for speculation. Family members, meanwhile, were navigating a landscape of fear and uncertainty. Private grief collided with public scrutiny in ways that amplified pain. One cousin recounted the difficulty of separating factual details from rumor. It was like walking through a storm of voices. Some were supportive, some judgmental, and some completely misinformed. The hardest part was watching Nick try to hold himself together while the world whispered doubts about him. The pressure on Nick was immense. He was not only grieving, but also being forced to confront the possibility that those closest to his family, or the world at large, might assume the worst. The media played an undeniable role in shaping public perception. News outlets, eager for breaking stories, reported cautiously, often citing unnamed sources or family acquaintances. Yet even cautious reporting can carry implications. Terms like under investigation or sources suggest can inadvertently suggest guilt in the minds of viewers. The speed at which information traveled, coupled with the human tendency to assume patterns of blame, created a perfect storm of suspicion around Nick. Social media platforms amplified this effect exponentially. Posts circulated with claims both vague and specific, some alleging financial disputes, others speculating about long-standing family tensions. Every thread, every comment, became part of a larger narrative that began to take on a life of its own. In such an environment, the distinction between fact and rumor becomes blurred. Even small pieces of unverified information can shape perceptions in profound ways, leaving an indelible mark on the public consciousness. Yet amid the growing storm, it's important to recognize that accusations, especially those made publicly, are not evidence. They are conjecture, fueled by fear, curiosity, and sometimes malice. Nick Reiner's position was uniquely difficult. He had lost both parents and was now navigating a labyrinth of suspicion. Every friend, neighbor, and acquaintance who had known the family had their own interpretation of events, their own biases and assumptions. In this climate, Nick's silence, whether chosen or imposed by circumstance, was often misread, further complicating public understanding. The intensity of the accusations also illuminated a broader societal issue, the tendency to assume guilt in high-profile tragedies. When a family experiences sudden and shocking loss, observers naturally seek explanations. The human brain craves closure, patterns, and understanding. In the absence of confirmed facts, suspicion often turns inward, landing on the most convenient target. In the Reiner case, Nick became that target, not because of evidence, but because he occupied the role of the son in a narrative the public was trying desperately to make sense of. Friends and family who supported Nick emphasized his character, noting his history of care, responsibility, and affection toward his parents. They recounted stories of ordinary devotion, helping with household projects, accompanying them to medical appointments, engaging in thoughtful conversations. and contrasted these with the implausibility of the allegations. Yet, even as these testimonies emerged, they were often drowned out by the louder, more sensational narratives taking root online and in media coverage. By the end of the day, the Reiner family's tragedy had evolved into a story that was no longer solely about grief. It had become a public spectacle, a case study in rumor, suspicion, and the human need to assign blame. The narrative was no longer confined to private mourning. It had become a collective story shaped by millions of observers, each with their own assumptions, biases, and interpretations. And in the midst of this maelstrom, Nick Reiner prepared to take a step that would define the next phase of the story, speaking publicly to assert his innocence. The accusations had set the stage for a dramatic confrontation between public perception and personal truth. Nick's voice, until this moment, had been silent. That silence, intentional or otherwise, was interpreted in a myriad of ways. Some saw it as composure, others as guilt, and still others as the natural response of someone overwhelmed by grief. But Nick's decision to speak was more than a declaration. It was a necessary act of self-preservation, a step toward reclaiming control over a narrative that had spiraled far beyond his private world. And when Nick finally broke his silence, the words he chose carried immense weight. I am not the killer. 3 simple words, yet laden with the weight of grief, accusation, and determination. These words would challenge assumptions, provoke debate, and set the stage for a complex, emotional exploration of family, loss, and the human need to assert truth in the face of suspicion. But the story does not end with his declaration. The accusations, the speculation, and the narrative that had begun to crystallize would soon intersect with evidence, witnesses, and conflicting accounts, creating a web of uncertainty that no one could easily untangle. And in the heart of that uncertainty lies the question that will haunt this story. Who truly knows what happened? But what came next would change the trajectory of public perception. And even those closest to Nick would soon find themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. For days, Nick Reiner had remained silent. The world watched in anticipation, each passing hour amplifying both curiosity and speculation. Social media buzzed with theories, some plausible, others wildly speculative. News outlets ran headline after headline, some tentative, others sensational. Friends and family waited nervously, hoping that the truth would emerge, but fearing the consequences of what that truth might be. And then, finally, Nick spoke. The moment he broke his silence was not dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no shouting matches, no emotional outbursts. Instead, it was deliberate, measured, and unmistakably resolute. In his first public statement, he looked into the camera, or at least into the room filled with reporters, and said words that cut through the noise. I am not the killer. 3 words, simple yet laden with gravity, carrying the weight of grief, fear, and defiance all at once. To understand the significance of this statement, one must consider the context. Nick had just lost both of his parents, a traumatic and life-altering event. The grief he carried was profound, compounded by the burden of public suspicion. Speaking out in such circumstances was an act of courage, an assertion of personal truth in the face of overwhelming speculation. His words did not merely defend him. They demanded that the world pause, listen, and reconsider the assumptions that had begun to take root. In recounting his experiences, Nick offered a glimpse into both his daily life and the moments leading up to the tragedy. Friends and family described him as a devoted son, someone who maintained regular contact with his parents, checked in on their well-being, and participated actively in their lives. He recounted ordinary interactions, the kind that, in retrospect, would later be scrutinized under the harsh lens of suspicion. Each memory, each detail, was presented not to absolve himself through narrative alone, but to humanize his experience, to provide context for the unimaginable scenario he now faced. Nick's statement also addressed the emotional complexity of losing both parents simultaneously. He spoke of love, of grief, and of the impossibility of reconciling such profound loss with the accusations leveled against him. There was vulnerability in his voice, moments where his eyes betrayed the raw pain he felt. Yet there was also determination, an unwavering insistence that the narrative being constructed around him was inaccurate. He conveyed the duality of human emotion. Despair intertwined with resilience, sadness coexisting with defiance. The reaction to Nick's statement was immediate and polarizing. Some observers found relief in his words, believing in the sincerity of his declaration and acknowledging the implausibility of the accusations. Others, however, remained skeptical, interpreting his composure as either rehearsed or indicative of concealment. The statement, while definitive in content, did not end debate, it transformed it. It became a touchstone for discussion, argument, and speculation, further entangling Nick in the web of public perception. Experts in criminal psychology and media analysis weighed in, discussing the phenomenon of public perception, the role of social media in shaping narratives, and the psychological toll of being accused without substantiated evidence. They noted that individuals in Nick's position often experience heightened stress, anxiety, and isolation. Every interaction becomes fraught with potential judgment, every gesture scrutinized, and every word dissected. In this context, Nick's decision to speak out was not merely an act of self-defense. It was a critical step toward reclaiming agency over a narrative that had grown far beyond his private world. Friends and relatives who had long known Nick emphasized the sincerity of his statement. They recounted examples of his behavior that aligned with the claim of innocence. Consistent care for his parents, routine interactions that demonstrated commitment and affection, and moments of shared vulnerability that underscored the authenticity of his character. These testimonials, however heartfelt, struggled to compete with the velocity of rumor, media speculation, and the human tendency to seek immediate answers in the aftermath of tragedy. The timing of Nick's statement also played a crucial role. Coming days after the initial incident, it intersected with a period of intense public interest and speculation. The delay was not negligence or avoidance. It was a strategic and emotionally necessary pause, a moment to process grief, consult with advisors, and prepare to present a coherent, factual account. The public, however, often misinterpreted silence as evasiveness, illustrating the inherent tension between private mourning and public expectation. Nick's words also touched on broader themes that resonate universally: the fragility of trust, the volatility of assumption, and the importance of narrative control in moments of crisis. His insistence on truth highlights a profound human need to assert identity and morality in the face of misinterpretation. It is a reminder that in moments of accusation, especially those amplified by media and social networks, the ability to speak, to clarify, and to assert oneself is not only a legal or ethical act, but a profoundly human one. Despite the clarity of his statement, Nick's assertion did not end the controversy. Evidence, conflicting reports, and public perception continued to challenge his account. Friends and experts alike noted that innocence, while morally compelling, is often insufficient to quell the tide of speculation. The real story, one that would emerge gradually, layer by layer, required careful examination of the timeline, interactions, and all available evidence. In sharing his perspective, Nick provided a critical lens through which the world could view the events surrounding his parents' deaths. He reframed the narrative, shifting the focus from assumption to inquiry, from rumor to consideration. His declaration, simple yet profound, served as both shield and beacon, a shield against unfounded accusations, and a beacon for those seeking clarity amid chaos. But Nick's statement was just the beginning. It opened the door to a series of revelations, contradictions, and complexities that would unfold over the following weeks. The narrative was far from linear. Every detail, every recollection, and every report would intersect in unpredictable ways, challenging assumptions, provoking debate, and demanding careful scrutiny. The act of speaking out, while necessary and courageous, also marked the start of an arduous journey through public perception, investigative inquiry, and personal reckoning. And as Nick prepared to navigate the storm of attention, scrutiny, and speculation, the world would watch closely, analyzing each gesture, each word, and each pause for clues. His next steps would not only shape the narrative around his parents' deaths, but also illuminate the broader human dynamics at play in tragedy, accusation, and grief. But what came next would reveal a layer of complexity no one had anticipated. Evidence, witnesses, and circumstances that would complicate the story in ways even Nick could not have predicted. With Nick's public declaration of innocence, the focus shifted from speculation to the slow, meticulous work of investigation. The Los Angeles Police Department, alongside the Los Angeles Fire Department and other investigative units, began the painstaking process of piecing together the events leading to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner. Every detail mattered. The timeline of the day, the interactions between family members, the activities of neighbors, and the presence of anyone in the home in the hours prior. It was a process defined by precision, patience, and the necessity of separating fact from rumor. On the day following the tragedy, investigators returned to the Reiner residence, carefully documenting the scene, photographing the environment, and collecting evidence that might shed light on the circumstances. Each room, each item, each personal belonging was considered. Investigators looked for signs of forced entry, evidence of a struggle, and anything that could clarify what had occurred. They spoke to neighbors, family friends, and associates, attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events. While the public was hungry for answers, the authorities emphasized caution, warning that speculation could obscure facts. In this period, the media's role became particularly complex. While journalists respected the need for discretion in some cases, the public's appetite for information was insatiable. Headlines suggested narratives that had yet to be confirmed. Motives, tensions, and hypothetical scenarios were presented as plausible explanations, even when evidence was limited. Social media amplified these narratives, turning unverified reports into viral content almost instantly. In such an environment, investigators had to navigate the dual challenge of gathering evidence while managing the flood of external speculation. Nick's cooperation with authorities was central to the investigation. He provided detailed accounts of the days leading up to the deaths, his interactions with both parents, and his own movements on December 14th. Friends and legal advisors describe him as forthcoming, candid, and willing to assist in clarifying misunderstandings. Every statement he made was cross-referenced with witness accounts, surveillance footage, and other data sources, creating a timeline intended to either support or challenge his version of events. The investigation also examined the dynamics within the household. Investigators spoke to neighbors about any unusual activity or disturbances, neighbors who might have overheard arguments, or anyone who might have seen interactions between Nick and his parents that day. Some neighbors recalled normal activity, the casual rhythms of a family going about their lives. Others mentioned brief tensions or minor disagreements, which, while ordinary, were scrutinized in the context of tragedy. Every small detail, every ordinary moment, became potentially significant. Financial records, phone logs, and communications were also reviewed. Investigators sought to understand whether there were any external factors, debts, disputes, or relationships that might have influenced the events. In high-profile cases, financial motives are often considered, even if the individuals involved had no prior history of criminal behavior. These inquiries, while invasive, are part of the procedural rigor that law enforcement follows to ensure no stone is left unturned. Even as investigators worked behind the scenes, the public narrative continued to evolve. Analysts on television discussed potential motives, family psychologists offered interpretations of household dynamics, and online forums speculated endlessly. Every leak, whether intentional or accidental, added complexity to the perception of guilt or innocence. Friends of Nick were caught between defending him and respecting the official process, highlighting the tension between personal knowledge and public narrative. For Nick, the investigative process was an additional burden layered atop grief. Each question, each interview, each request for clarification required emotional resilience. To recount ordinary interactions with his parents in detail was emotionally taxing, as each memory carried both love and loss. Yet, his willingness to participate fully illustrated a commitment to truth, a desire to assert his innocence, and an understanding that transparency was essential to navigating both the legal and social dimensions of the tragedy. The investigative team also examined physical evidence meticulously. Forensic specialists looked for traces of struggle, DNA evidence, and other indicators that could clarify how Rob and Michelle had died. In complex cases, small details. A fingerprint, a misplaced object, or a subtle change in the home environment can become pivotal. Investigators approached every detail with caution, aware that premature conclusions could jeopardize both the accuracy of the investigation and the perception of fairness. During this time, family dynamics remained under scrutiny. Friends and extended family members provided insight into long-standing patterns of interaction, the emotional climate of the household, and any prior tensions that might have relevance. While some recollections painted a picture of harmony and devotion, others highlighted moments of conflict or disagreement. Investigators, recognizing the human tendency for selective memory and bias, carefully cross-referenced accounts to discern patterns that were consistent and relevant. Public perception, however, remained volatile. Despite the methodical nature of the investigation, online speculation continued to dominate headlines. The narrative of the grieving son turned accused perpetrator captured attention, and every new piece of information was interpreted through the lens of existing assumptions. Experts in criminal justice emphasize that in high-profile cases, public opinion often diverges from evidence-based conclusions, underscoring the importance of patience, diligence, and reliance on facts over rumor. By the end of the initial investigative phase, several key themes emerged. Nick was cooperative, providing detailed accounts. The household dynamics were complex but largely ordinary, and the need for careful evidence collection was paramount. The investigation set the foundation for subsequent developments, balancing the imperatives of thoroughness with the realities of public scrutiny. Yet the investigation was only beginning to reveal its layers. Each new witness, each piece of evidence, and each analysis of household interactions would add depth, and sometimes contradiction, to the emerging narrative. The tension between perception and reality, between rumor and fact, would become more pronounced as the case unfolded. And what investigators discovered next, the contradictions, the subtle details, and the pieces that did not fit neatly into existing assumptions, would challenge the narrative the public had already begun to construct. It would be the first glimpse of complexity that no headline could capture and no rumor could adequately explain. To understand what happened on December 14, 2025, it is essential to reconstruct the day with precision. A timeline is not merely a sequence of events. It is a lens through which motive, opportunity, and circumstance can be examined. For Nick, for investigators, and for the public, the timeline became both a tool for clarity and a source of tension, as every moment of that day was scrutinized, debated, and reinterpreted. The day began like many others in the Reiner household. Early morning light spilled through the windows as Rob and Michelle followed their usual routines. Rob, a man of habit and discipline, started his day with coffee and the morning paper, reading each headline with measured attention. Michelle, balancing warmth with practicality, prepared breakfast while checking emails and attending to household responsibilities. Observers note the ordinary nature of these routines, yet in retrospect, every detail gained significance. Nick's morning movements were similarly routine. He arrived at the house, greeted his parents, and engaged in casual conversation. Witnesses recall seeing him laughing with Michelle as she prepared breakfast, sharing a brief discussion with Rob about household matters, and later stepping out briefly to attend to errands. These ordinary interactions, however mundane, became crucial pieces in the reconstruction of events. Investigators meticulously recorded the timing, noting arrival and departure times, conversations, and any anomalies in behavior. By mid-morning, the day's routine continued. Neighbors recalled seeing Rob tending to small tasks around the house, Michelle checking on correspondence, and Nick returning to the residence after a short absence. It was during this period that investigators focused on establishing a pattern of normalcy, seeking to determine whether any irregularities could indicate tension, conflict, or potential foul play. Every action, from a coffee cup left on the counter to a conversation overheard in passing, was treated as a potential clue. Lunch and early afternoon were similarly uneventful on the surface. Witnesses described ordinary activity. The family preparing and consuming meals, engaging in light conversation, and maintaining their regular routines. It is often in these ordinary moments that investigators look for the subtle signals that distinguish routine from disruption. In the Reiner household, every ordinary moment carried layers of meaning, amplified by the knowledge of what was to come. At approximately 3:30 p.m., the ordinary day turned into tragedy. Emergency responders received a call requesting medical assistance at the Reiner residence. By the time the Los Angeles Fire Department arrived, Rob and Michelle had been found dead. The rapid transition from ordinary life to catastrophe is one of the most striking aspects of this timeline, illustrating how quickly the fabric of daily existence can unravel. Investigators immediately began reconstructing the events leading up to the discovery. They reviewed surveillance footage from surrounding areas, interviewed neighbors and acquaintances, and examined physical evidence inside the home. The goal was to create a comprehensive timeline that accounted for every movement, every interaction, and every anomaly. Even seemingly trivial details, such as a door left ajar, a misplaced object, or a brief absence, were analyzed for potential significance. Nick's account of the day was central to this reconstruction. He described interactions with both parents, his errands, and the return to the residence in the hours preceding the discovery. His version of events aligned with several witness accounts, but investigators noted discrepancies and sought clarification. This process of cross-referencing is critical in any high-profile case, as it allows authorities to establish a coherent narrative while identifying areas requiring further investigation. Throughout this period, public interest remained intense. Social media timelines speculated on minute details, often misinterpreting ordinary behavior as evidence of guilt. News outlets reported on timelines with caution, emphasizing the ongoing nature of the investigation while attempting to balance transparency with discretion. For Nick, navigating both the public's interpretation of the timeline and the official investigative process was an added strain, as every movement was scrutinized and every statement analyzed. By evening, a clearer picture of the day's sequence had begun to emerge. Rob and Michelle's routines, Nick's interactions, and the sequence of arrivals and departures were documented in detail. Investigators emphasized that while the timeline was crucial, it alone could not establish motive or intent. It was, however, indispensable for contextualizing the events, identifying inconsistencies, and providing a factual basis against which rumors and speculation could be measured.